They were never meant to be found.
Every grave hides a story.
Some stories should stay buried.
There are some letters that arrive too late to matter. And then there are letters that arrive at the exact moment they were always meant to. The one that arrived for Walter Crane came during the cold autumn of 1887, on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in a town so small most maps ignored it completely. Hollowbrook sat quietly in the foothills of western Pennsylvania, tucked between forests that seemed older than the roads cutting through them. It was the kind of place where smoke curled slowly from chimneys at dusk, where people locked their doors out of habit rather than fear, and where nothing truly unusual had happened in decades. At least that was what people believed. Walter lived alone on the eastern side of town in a narrow brick house that looked almost permanently tired. The bricks had darkened over the years from rain and coal smoke, and the green paint around the front door had begun peeling in long faded strips. Every morning before work, he scraped his boots 3 times against the iron scraper beside the steps. Always 3 on the left side, always 3 on the right. He was a careful man, the kind of man who folded shirts perfectly, the kind who sharpened pencils evenly, the kind who noticed if a picture frame had shifted even slightly on a wall. For nearly 20 years, Walter worked as a copy clerk for a small law office on Mercer Street. He spent most of his days bent over contracts and deeds, carefully reproducing documents in dark black ink, with handwriting so precise it almost looked printed. His hands were steady. His mother used to tell him that steady hands were a blessing. Walter never married, not because he disliked people. He simply carried a quietness around him that made closeness difficult. Conversations exhausted him. Crowded rooms made him uncomfortable. So he settled into routines instead. Routines were predictable. Routines didn't leave. Every Sunday evening, he wrote his grocery list on yellow paper. Every Wednesday, he polished his shoes. Every winter, he stacked firewood in perfectly measured rows beside the house. And every night before bed, he checked the front door lock twice. The strange thing is that people later described Walter as lonely, but Walter himself never thought of it that way. Solitude had become so natural to him that he barely noticed the silence anymore. Until the letter came. That evening the rain had already soaked through the edges of his coat by the time he reached home. Thin fog drifted through Hollowbrook streets, wrapping around the dim gas lamps in soft gray halos. Walter climbed the path toward his house with his head lowered against the drizzle. And then he stopped. There was an envelope resting on the iron shelf beside his front door. At first glance, it looked ordinary enough. Cream-colored paper, slightly thick, expensive maybe, but something about it immediately felt wrong. Walter would later struggle to explain exactly what unsettled him. Maybe it was the wax seal pressed into the center of the envelope. Or maybe it was the handwriting. His full name stretched across the front in long, slanting ink. Mr. Walter Edmund Crane of Hollowbrook. Nobody wrote like that anymore. Rain dripped from the edge of Walter's hat as he stared at it. The envelope looked strangely untouched by the weather. Not dry exactly, but untouched, as though the rain itself had avoided landing on it. His stomach tightened. There had been no knock at the door. No footsteps. No sign of whoever delivered it. Just a letter waiting silently beside the entrance. For a long moment, Walter simply stood there listening to the rain. Then slowly, carefully, he picked it up. The paper felt warm. Not warm from sunlight. Not warm for being indoors. Warm like it had been held against someone's chest moments earlier. Walter felt a sudden chill crawl across the back of his neck. Inside the house, he lit an oil lamp beside the window and sat at his writing desk. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass while wind moved through the narrow street beyond. Somewhere farther down the road, a carriage rattled through puddles before disappearing into the fog. Walter placed the envelope carefully on the desk. The wax seal showed the shape of a leafless tree. Its branches twisted upward like thin black fingers. And the moment Walter saw it clearly, something old and buried shifted inside his memory. A voice. Weak, fading, almost forgotten. Walter, if a letter ever comes with a tree on it, burn it before you read it. His mother. The memory returned, so suddenly it left him frozen. Cordelia Crane had spoken those words 18 years earlier, while dying in a boarding house room in Pittsburgh. Fever had consumed her slowly over 8 terrible days. By the end, she barely recognized the room around her. Walter remembered sitting beside her bed while rain hammered softly against the windows outside. Her face had looked pale and distant beneath the candlelight. "If a letter comes," she whispered, "you must burn it." At the time, Walter thought the fever was speaking for her. People said strange things before death sometimes. He promised anyway, because promises were easier than arguments. And a few hours later she was gone. Walter had not thought about those words once in nearly 2 decades. Until now. The wax seal stared back at him from the desk. A leafless tree. Walter suddenly realized his hands were trembling. He opened the envelope using the small bone-handled knife he kept beside the lamp. The blade slid cleanly beneath the paper fold. Inside was a single sheet written in dark ink. The handwriting matched the name on the envelope. Long, precise, uncomfortably calm. Walter unfolded the paper slowly. The letter began immediately. To the last living son of the Crane line. Walter frowned. He continued reading. By the terms set forth in the year 1826 and renewed faithfully in every generation since, you are required to return to the property at Vesper Hollow before the close of the harvest moon. The house has been kept for you. The fields have been kept for you. The matter beneath the south stone has been kept for you. Come alone. Bring nothing that does not belong to you. The letter ended with a single signature. D. Nothing more. Walter read the page again, and then again. The room around him seemed strangely quiet now. Even the rain outside sounded distant somehow. Vesper Hollow. He had never heard the name before. Walter knew almost nothing about his family beyond his parents. His father died when Walter was still very young. His mother rarely spoke about relatives. There had been vague mentions of cousins somewhere farther south once, but those people had faded from memory years ago. As far as Walter knew, he was the last Crane alive. Yet this letter spoke as though generations had been expecting him. The last living son. The phrase settled heavily in his chest. Walter turned the envelope over, searching for a return address. There was none. No postmark either. No sign it had passed through any postal office at all. Only a faint smear of dark soil along the bottom edge, as though someone had carried it through dirt roads for a very long time. Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. The lamp flame flickered beside him. He should have burned the letter. Years later, he would repeat that sentence over and over to the only friend he ever told this story to. I should have burned it. If he had thrown the paper into the lamp flame that night, everything afterward might have ended differently. He could have remained in Hollowbrook, continued working at the law office, continued polishing shoes every Wednesday, continued growing old quietly inside his narrow brick house. Instead, he sat at that desk for nearly an hour while rain fell outside and thoughts moved slowly through his mind like dark water. The strange part was not curiosity. It was recognition. Somewhere deep inside himself, Walter felt something terrible and undeniable. The letter had not found the wrong man. By midnight, he had already made the decision, though he would not admit it even to himself until the next morning. On Wednesday, he visited the county records office before work. The building sat near the courthouse square beneath a faded clock tower that no longer kept accurate time. Inside smelled of dust, old paper, and lamp oil. Tall wooden cabinets lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Behind the front desk sat Hollis Reagan. Hollis had worked county records for almost 30 years. Broad-shouldered, heavy-bearded, permanently tired-looking. He knew every road, every family name, every abandoned property within 4 counties. Walter approached carefully. "Hollis," he said quietly, "have you ever heard of a place called Vesper Hollow?" The effect was immediate. Hollis stopped moving. The pen in his hand froze halfway across the page. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Then very slowly he looked up, and Walter saw something he had never seen before in the older man's face. Fear, not confusion, not surprise. Recognition. "Where?" Hollis asked softly. "Did you hear that name?" Walter hesitated before removing the letter from his coat pocket. Hollis read it silently, and with every line his expression darkened further. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Hollis stood and walked toward the back cabinets. He unlocked the lowest drawer with a small brass key. From inside, he removed a thin yellow folder. The folder looked ancient. Its edges were worn soft with age. Hollis carried it back to the desk, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he stared at Walter for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Mr. Crane, I need you to listen carefully to me." Walter felt cold all over. Hollis rested one hand on the folder. "In 30 years working this office," he said, "3 men carrying the name Crane have come here asking about Vesper Hollow." Walter said nothing. They all received letters. The room suddenly felt smaller. Hollis continued. Every one of them went east into the hills after receiving those letters. He paused. None of them ever came back.
Walter stared at Hollis Reagan without speaking. For a moment neither man moved. Outside the records office, wagon wheels rolled softly through the wet streets of Hollowbrook while distant church bells marked the late morning hour. Somewhere near the courthouse entrance, 2 men laughed about something ordinary. Life continued only a few feet away from them exactly as it always had. But inside that small room filled with old paper and dust, something had shifted. Hollis opened the yellow folder slowly. The papers inside looked fragile enough to crumble if handled too roughly. Some were handwritten notes. Others appeared to be copied deeds and property records. Walter noticed several names written repeatedly across different pages. Crane. Again and again. Hollis removed a folded sheet and laid it carefully on the desk between them. "This was the first," he said quietly. Walter leaned closer. The page was dated October of 1826. The ink had faded brown with age, but the signature near the bottom remained visible. Cornelius Crane. "There have been 12 altogether," Hollis continued. 12 men carrying the Crane name, every one of them connected to the same piece of land east of the Allegheny Ridge. Walter looked up slowly. 12. Hollis nodded once. The first was Cornelius Crane, farmer, 44 years old. Lost most of his land during the drought of 1825. According to county records, he nearly went bankrupt before suddenly recovering everything within a single year. Walter listened carefully. "There are almost no details after that," Hollis said. "Only the land deed, the property transfer, and then strange gaps." "What kind of gaps?" Hollis gave a tired shrug. "Missing pages, missing signatures, missing years. Entire records removed from books that should have contained them." Walter felt a growing heaviness settle into his stomach. Hollis pulled another document from the folder. This one came later, 1841. The name on the page read Elias Crane. Another followed, 1858. Another, 1871. Selwyn Crane. Walter recognized the name immediately from Hollis's earlier story. The watchmaker from Rochester. "He never came back?" Walter asked quietly. Hollis shook his head. "Not a trace." The older man lowered his voice slightly, almost as though afraid someone nearby might overhear them. "Mr. Crane, I need you to understand something. I spent years trying to figure this out. Longer than I care to admit. There are parcels of land tied to old family names all over Pennsylvania. That part isn't unusual. But this," he tapped the folder gently, "this place doesn't behave like ordinary land." Walter frowned. "What does that mean?" Hollis leaned back slowly in his chair. "It means maps change around it." Walter said nothing. "At first I thought it was a clerical error. Roads disappearing, survey lines shifting, small inconsistencies. But every decade the records move farther apart. Older maps show roads leading east into a valley that newer maps completely ignore." A silence settled between them. Hollis continued quietly. "And then there's the bank." "The bank." "The taxes on the property have been paid every year since 1826 by the same bank in Philadelphia." Walter waited. "The problem," Hollis said carefully, is that no one can find the bank anymore. A cold feeling crawled through Walter's chest. What do you mean no one can find it? I mean the address listed on the documents doesn't exist. Walter stared at him. No building, no business, nothing. Hollis rubbed one tired hand across his beard. I wrote letters years ago trying to trace the payments. Never got answers. It's like the bank only exists on paper. Walter looked down at the folder again. The names, the dates, the repeating pattern. Something about it all felt impossible. And yet the papers sat directly in front of him. Real. Physical. Waiting. Why keep the records? Walter finally asked. Hollis was quiet for several seconds before answering. Because someone has to remember. The sentence lingered heavily in the room. Walter suddenly became aware of the rain still tapping softly against the office windows. The sound felt strangely far away now. Hollis folded his hands carefully on the desk. Mr. Crane, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Walter nodded slowly. Are you planning to go? Walter opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out, because the truth was he had already decided. The decision formed the moment he opened the letter. Some part of him had recognized the path immediately, even while the rest of him resisted it. Hollis saw the answer anyway. The older man closed his eyes briefly. I was afraid of that. Walter looked away toward the dusty office windows. Have any of them ever explained why they went? No. Did any of them seem frightened? Hollis let out a quiet breath. All of them. The room fell silent again. Finally Hollis reached into the folder one last time and removed a smaller folded paper. This is all I have left from the last man. Walter took it carefully. The page contained only a short handwritten note. If this reaches the office before I return, burn every record connected to Vesper Hollow. The handwriting trembled unevenly across the page. It was signed Selwyn Crane. Walter stared at the ink for a long moment. When was this written? The morning before he disappeared. Walter folded the note carefully and handed it back. Hollis returned everything to the folder except the original letter. That remained resting on the desk between them. The leafless tree seal stared upward like something alive. You still have time to walk away from this, Hollis said quietly. Walter almost laughed. Not because the suggestion was funny, because it already felt impossible. That frightened him more than anything else. By the time Walter left the records office, the rain had stopped. Thin fog drifted lazily through Hollowbrook streets while weak afternoon sunlight pressed dimly through the clouds overhead. He walked home slowly. Every familiar thing around him suddenly felt strange. The bakery near Mercer Street, the narrow sidewalks, the church tower rising above the rooftops. All of it looked slightly unreal now, as though Hollowbrook itself had begun slipping away from him. Back inside his brick house, Walter stood motionless for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the letter on his desk. Then quietly, almost mechanically, he began packing. One extra coat, 2 clean shirts, a shaving razor, his pocket watch, a small leather notebook. He packed carefully because careful habits were the only thing keeping his thoughts steady. Outside evening settled slowly over the town. Walter paused once while folding a shirt. The house felt unusually quiet tonight. Not empty exactly. Listening. The thought unsettled him immediately. He finished packing faster after that. Near midnight, he sat alone beside the oil lamp reading the letter again. The matter beneath the Southstone has been kept for you. What did that even mean? Walter tried to imagine what kind of place Vesper Hollow actually was. An abandoned farm? An old estate? A family burial ground? Every possibility sounded absurd. And yet none of them explained the fear sitting inside his chest. At some point during the night, Walter realized something else that disturbed him deeply. His mother had known. Not details, perhaps, but enough to fear the letter. Enough to warn him 18 years earlier while dying. Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside wind moved softly through Hollowbrook's empty streets. Somewhere far away a dog barked once before falling silent again. Walter stared at the wax seal until the oil lamp burned low. The leafless tree, twisted branches stretching upward into darkness. Waiting. The next morning he boarded the train east. And as Hollowbrook disappeared slowly behind him through smoke and fog, Walter felt with growing certainty that he was not traveling toward a place. He was traveling toward something that had already been expecting him for a very long time. The train carried Walter east through the Pennsylvania hills beneath a sky the color of cold iron. For most of the journey, he sat silently beside the window watching forests slide past in long dark stretches. Small towns appeared occasionally between the trees. Narrow church steeples, smoke drifting from chimneys, empty roads wet from recent rain. But the farther east the train traveled, the stranger the landscape began to feel. The hills grew steeper, the forests thicker. Even the light seemed different somehow. Walter could not explain that part later, though he tried many times. It wasn't darker exactly. The world simply looked quieter, as though the sunlight itself had grown cautious. By late afternoon, the train reached a small junction town called Sherbrooke. The station consisted of little more than a platform, a freight shed, and a weather-stained sign hanging crooked beside the tracks. Walter stepped off carrying his leather valise while steam rolled heavily around him from the engine. Sherbrooke smelled of wet wood and coal smoke. A few men stood outside the station talking quietly near a wagon loaded with crates. They glanced at Walter only briefly before returning to their conversation. No one smiled. Walter checked the folded paper Hollis Reagan had given him before leaving Hollowbrook. Find a driver named Otis Llewellyn. He knows the eastern roads. That was all the note said. Walter spotted the wagon near the far side of the station yard almost immediately. Two thin horses stood hitched to an old flatbed wagon, while an elderly man adjusted leather straps near the harness. He was tall but painfully lean, with long gray mustaches hanging past the corners of his mouth. His coat looked older than Walter himself. "Mr. Llewellyn?" Walter asked carefully. The old man glanced up slowly. His eyes settled on Walter's face, then on the valise, then finally on the cream-colored envelope partially visible inside Walter's coat pocket. Something unreadable passed briefly across the old man's expression. "You're the one from Hollowbrook," he said quietly. Walter felt a small chill. "How did you know?" Otis gave a tired shrug. "People don't come east this time of year unless they've been called." The sentence landed heavily between them. Walter waited for further explanation. None came. Otis climbed onto the wagon seat. "Well," he muttered, "might as well get moving." The road east out of Sherbrooke wound slowly upward through endless forests. For the first few hours, the journey almost felt ordinary. They passed scattered farms where thin columns of smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Children played near split rail fences. Dogs barked as the wagon rolled by. Occasionally, another traveler appeared heading west carrying sacks of grain or bundles of wood. Otis knew many of them by name. He lifted 2 fingers from the reins in quiet greeting whenever someone passed. At first, the people greeted him back. But gradually Walter noticed something unsettling. The farther east they traveled, the quieter the responses became. Eventually people stopped waving entirely. They simply watched the wagon pass. Silent, expressionless. One old woman standing beside a fence actually crossed herself when she saw Walter sitting beside Otis. Walter pretended not to notice. By sunset they reached a small village tucked between low wooded hills. Walter never learned its name. The buildings leaned slightly with age, and most windows remained dark despite the approaching evening. A faded church stood crooked near the center of town, while dead leaves drifted through empty streets. As they passed through the village, Walter noticed several people staring openly now. Not curious, afraid. The feeling tightened around him slowly. Near the far edge of town, Otis pointed toward a weathered stone marker half buried beside the road. Walter leaned slightly to read it. Most of the carving had worn away with time. Only one word remained clearly visible. Vesper. Walter looked toward Otis immediately. The old man kept his eyes fixed ahead on the road. "You know where it is?" Walter said quietly. Otis remained silent for several moments. Finally, he nodded once. I know where the valley begins. And after that? Otis's jaw tightened slightly. After that, he said softly. The road belongs to you. The wagon wheels rattled slowly across uneven dirt while dusk settled through the trees around them. Walter studied the old driver carefully. You've taken others there. Not a question. Otis nodded again. How many? The old man's eyes remained fixed ahead. 2. Walter waited. The first was years ago. Calm fellow. Said he had family business east of the ridge. Otis paused. The second one barely spoke at all. Nervous. Kept checking behind us like he thought something was following. What happened to them? Otis gave a dry, humorless laugh. You already know the answer to that. Darkness thickened around the wagon. By full night, they made camp beside a narrow clearing near the road. Otis built a small fire while Walter unpacked bread and cheese from his satchel. The forest surrounding them felt immense. Ancient somehow. The trees rose like black walls against the night sky, while cold wind moved softly through the branches overhead. For a while neither man spoke. Then quietly Walter asked the question that had been haunting him since leaving Hollowbrook. What is Vesper Hollow? Otis stared into the fire. After a very long silence he finally answered. I don't rightly know. Walter frowned. You've never been there? No. Why not? The old man looked up slowly. Because the men I took there never came back. The fire crackled softly between them. Otis continued in a lower voice. There are places in these hills people learn not to approach. Old valleys, old roads, places where animals stop crossing after dark. Walter listened carefully. My grandfather used to say the land remembers things long after people forget them. Another long silence followed. Wind moved through the trees overhead. Then suddenly everything stopped. Completely. Walter noticed it instantly. The wind vanished. The insects stopped. Even the horses became unnaturally still. The silence that settled over the clearing did not feel natural. Felt enormous. Heavy. Walter slowly turned his head toward the surrounding forest. The trees stood motionless now. Every branch. Every leaf. Frozen. What's happening? Walter whispered. Otis did not look at him. Don't move. The old man's voice sounded strangely tight. Walter felt his pulse begin hammering harder inside his chest. The silence deepened further. And then Walter realized something even worse. The fire had stopped crackling. The flames still moved, but they made no sound. A terrible pressure slowly built inside the clearing, like the feeling before a violent storm breaks. Walter stared into the darkness between the trees. For one horrifying moment he thought he saw movement there. Tall shapes standing silently beyond the firelight. Watching. Not animals. Not people either. Just shapes. Too still to be alive. Then an owl cried somewhere far away. Instantly the forest sounds returned all at once. Wind rushed through the branches. The horses snorted nervously. The fire cracked sharply. Walter sucked in a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Otis finally relaxed slightly beside him. Neither man spoke for several minutes afterward. Eventually Walter managed to ask, "What was that?" Otis stared into the flames. Best not to ask. Walter barely slept that night. Every small sound outside the camp pulled him awake again. And each time he opened his eyes, he found Otis still sitting beside the fire staring silently into the dark woods beyond the clearing, as though waiting for something to return. Sometime near dawn Walter woke again to the sound of whispering. At first he thought he was dreaming. The sound was faint, distant, almost hidden beneath the wind moving through the trees. He slowly pushed himself upright beneath his blanket. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only dim orange embers glowing near the center of the clearing. Otis remained awake beside them, though now the old man looked pale and exhausted. Walter listened carefully. The whispering came again. Several voices this time, too far away to understand clearly. Walter looked toward the forest. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper now than the rest of the night around them. And then he realized the whispers were not coming from one direction. They surrounded the clearing completely. Soft, overlapping voices circling slowly through the woods. Walter's throat tightened. "Otis!" The old man raised one hand immediately. Silent. The whispers drifted closer. Walter could almost make out words now. Not full sentences. Fragments. His name. He was certain he heard his own name. Walter. Softly spoken somewhere beyond the trees. Then another voice. And another. Some sounding male. Some female. One sounding painfully young. Walter felt cold all over. The horses began pulling nervously against their restraints, breathing harder now. Otis stood slowly beside the dying fire. For the first time since meeting him, Walter saw genuine fear in the old man's eyes. Without speaking, Otis reached into his coat and removed something small wrapped tightly in cloth. Walter watched him toss it directly into the embers. A sudden sharp smell filled the clearing instantly. But this silence felt different from before. Not empty. Waiting. Otis sat back down heavily beside the fire. Walter stared at him. "What did you throw in there?" The old man rubbed both hands slowly across his face before answering. "My mother used to call it blackroot." "What does it do?" Otis looked toward the woods. "Keeps certain things from coming too close." Walter wished he hadn't asked. Walter did not sleep again after that. The whispers never returned, but the memory of them lingered heavily in his mind for the rest of the night. Every time the wind shifted through the trees, he found himself listening carefully, half expecting those distant voices to begin circling the clearing again. By morning the forest looked gray and exhausted beneath a layer of low-hanging fog. Otis packed the wagon silently. Neither man mentioned the whispers. Walter noticed the old driver avoiding the woods entirely now. He kept his movements quick and deliberate, eyes lowered toward the horses and supplies as though refusing to look beyond the edges of the clearing. They resumed traveling shortly after sunrise. The road east had changed overnight. Walter was certain of it. The trees stood closer now, their branches twisting overhead like dark fingers interlocking above the narrow path. Even the air felt heavier somehow, colder, harder to breathe. The horses seemed uneasy too. They moved slower than before, occasionally snorting nervously while their ears twitched toward the forest around them. Several times Walter thought he saw movement between the trees. Not animals. Shapes, always too distant to identify clearly. Whenever he turned his head directly toward them, they vanished. By late morning the wagon reached a narrow wooden bridge crossing a black river. Walter immediately noticed how strange the water looked. Barely moved. The surface reflected the sky with unnatural stillness, dark as polished glass. Otis stopped the horses before crossing. For several seconds he simply sat there staring at the bridge ahead. Then quietly he said, "Once we cross this river, I won't be going any farther." Walter looked toward him. "You're leaving me here?" Otis nodded slowly. "The valley begins on the other side." Walter stared ahead. The bridge creaked softly in the wind. Beyond it the forest thickened into an almost solid wall of dark trees climbing upward along the hills. No smoke, no roads, no sign of life, only silence. Walter swallowed carefully. "How far is the house?" "About 3 miles east along the trail." "You've seen it before?" Otis hesitated. "Once." Walter waited. "It was years ago," the old man said quietly. "Fog was thicker than I'd ever seen. Could barely make out the road. But I remember the roof standing above the trees." Something dark crossed Otis's expression. "And I remember the feeling." "What feeling?" The old man looked directly at Walter for the first time since leaving camp. "Like something had already noticed me." A chill spread slowly through Walter's chest. Otis climbed down from the wagon and began unloading Walter's valise. "You'll continue on foot from here." Walter accepted the bag slowly. Part of him wanted to argue, to demand answers, to insist the old man come farther. But another part already knew it wouldn't matter. Otis had reached the edge of whatever boundary existed around Vesper Hollow, and he had no intention of crossing it. Before Walter turned toward the bridge, Otis grabbed his arm firmly. The old man's eyes looked deeply tired now. "If you hear someone calling your name after dark," he said quietly, "don't answer." Walter felt cold immediately. Otis released him. "And if the house offers you food?" He stopped speaking. The silence stretched several uncomfortable seconds. Finally, Walter asked, "What if it does?" Otis stepped backward toward the wagon. "Pray you're still hungry when morning comes." Then, without another word, the old man climbed back onto the wagon seat and turned the horses west. Walter watched him disappear slowly down the road until fog swallowed both wagon and driver completely. And then he was alone. The silence surrounding the river felt immense. Walter adjusted his grip on the valise and slowly crossed the bridge. The wood groaned softly beneath his boots. Halfway across, he stopped briefly and looked down at the water. Something moved beneath the surface, a pale shape drifting slowly far below. Walter stepped back instinctively. The movement vanished immediately. He told himself it was only reflection. Nothing more. But his pulse continued racing long after he reached the opposite side. The trail east was barely visible now. Thin dirt winding between endless trees. Walter walked slowly beneath the heavy forest canopy while fog drifted between the trunks around him. Dead leaves covered the ground in thick layers, muting almost every sound except his own footsteps. The deeper he traveled, the stranger the woods became. The trees grew enormous. Some looked centuries old. Their bark twisted into shapes resembling faces caught mid-scream. At one point, Walter noticed dozens of animal skeletons scattered beside the trail. Small things mostly: foxes, birds, rabbits, all lying strangely untouched among the leaves. No bite marks, no decay, just white bones resting silently beneath the trees. Walter tried not to look at them. Around noon, he found the first marker. A wooden post hammered beside the trail. The carving on its surface had nearly faded away with age. But Walter could still make out the symbol burned into the center. A leafless tree, the exact same symbol from the wax seal. A cold pressure settled slowly inside his chest. Someone had marked this path long ago. And not recently either. The wood looked ancient. Walter continued walking. The fog thickened steadily as afternoon approached. Soon visibility dropped so badly he could barely see 20 feet ahead. The forest around him faded into shifting gray shadows while silence pressed heavily from every direction. Then he heard the bell. Soft, distant, almost swallowed by the fog. Walter froze immediately. The sound came again. A single deep bell toll somewhere far ahead in the woods. Not a church bell exactly. Older sounding. He listened carefully. Another toll echoed through the forest. Then silence. Walter stood motionless for several seconds before continuing forward. The bell rang again moments later. Closer now. The sound made his skin crawl. There was something wrong about it. Something hollow. As though the bell itself had been buried underground. Walter tightened his grip on the valise and walked faster. The trail began sloping downward through the hills. Gradually the fog ahead started thinning. And then Walter saw the valley. Vesper Hollow. It stretched silently between the surrounding hills beneath a blanket of pale gray mist. Dead fields rolled outward in every direction, their crops long withered and blackened. Narrow stone fences cut across the land like old scars disappearing into the fog. And at the center of it all stood the house. Walter stopped walking. For several long moments he simply stared. The farmhouse looked enormous. Far larger than he expected. 3 stories tall with dark wooden walls weathered nearly black by age. Several windows were broken while others reflected dull gray light from the overcast sky. One side of the roof sagged inward slightly as though part of the structure had collapsed years earlier. Yet despite its condition, the house did not look abandoned. It looked waiting. Walter felt that certainty immediately. The valley itself seemed arranged around the house like something orbiting a fixed center. The dead fields, the fences, the silent hills. Everything pointed toward it. Wind moved softly through the valley grass below, and somewhere far away the bell rang again. Walter descended slowly toward the farmhouse. As he moved deeper into the valley, he noticed something deeply unsettling. There were no birds. Not one. No crows. No sparrows. Nothing. The silence felt unnatural. Even the wind sounded muffled somehow. Walter passed an old well near the edge of the property. The stones surrounding it had collapsed partially inward with age, and thick moss covered the wooden frame above. As he walked past, he noticed scratches carved into the stones. Dozens of them. Lines. Symbols. Names. Some barely readable beneath dirt and moss. One name stood out clearly. Selwyn Crane. Walter stopped cold. The letters looked fresh compared to the others, as though carved only a few years earlier. A terrible feeling spread through him. He suddenly realized this was the first actual proof that Selwyn Crane truly reached the valley before disappearing. Walter looked down into the well. Darkness stared back endlessly. No water visible. Only blackness. And then faintly, very faintly, he heard breathing. Walter stumbled backward instantly. The sound vanished. His heart hammered violently now. He forced himself away from the well and continued toward the farmhouse. By the time he reached the porch, the daylight had already begun fading beneath thick storm clouds gathering above the valley. The front door stood slightly open. Walter froze at the bottom of the steps. He was absolutely certain the door had been closed moments earlier while approaching through the fields. Now it rested open several inches. Darkness visible inside. Walter climbed the porch slowly. Every wooden step creaked beneath his boots. The closer he moved toward the doorway, the colder the air became. By the time he reached the top step, he could actually see his breath. The smell drifting from inside the house reminded him strangely of old paper and wet soil. Walter stood there listening. Nothing. No movement. No voices. Only silence. Then from somewhere deep inside the house came the sound of a chair moving slowly across wooden floors. Walter felt every muscle in his body tighten. Someone was inside. Or something. The front door creaked wider on its own. A long dark hallway stretched inward beneath dim candlelight flickering somewhere farther inside the house. Walter should have turned back then. Every instinct inside him screamed to leave the valley immediately. But another feeling had begun growing stronger since crossing the bridge. Recognition. The terrible sense that all of this had already been waiting specifically for him. Slowly Walter stepped across the doorway into the house. And behind him, without warning, the front door slammed shut.